They had fortified the hill for months. Concrete bunkers stacked into the earth, interlocking fields of fire, hidden tunnels that breathed death the moment anyone came close. Entire units had failed to take it. Then one Marine stepped forward carrying a weapon that was never meant to be used by one man. A weapon so heavy it normally required two. 30 minutes later, 16 bunkers were silent. And the battlefield didn't understand what had just happened. This is Dark War Records. The island was already broken before the attack began. The ground was chewed apart by weeks of bombardment, but the bunkers remained. Reinforced concrete, buried steel, firing slits no wider than a helmet. Every approach had been measured, rehearsed, and sighted in. The Japanese defenders didn't need to see their enemy. They could hear them. Boots scraping volcanic ash, metal clinking, men breathing too loudly before realizing silence mattered more than courage. Every previous assault had ended the same way. Marines advanced. Bunkers woke up. Men fell. Machine gun fire didn't spray. It cut. Mortars landed where retreat should have been. Every bunker protected the next, forming a chain of death that could not be rushed or flanked. Command called it a stalemate. The Marines on the ground called it a wall. That morning, the air was heavy and unmoving. Smoke clung to the hill like something alive, refusing to lift. Visibility was low, but the bunkers didn't need clear sightlines. They only needed movement. When the order to advance came again, no one expected a breakthrough. They expected losses. They expected bodies. They did not expect one Marine to stand up, shoulder a two-man weapon alone, and start walking directly toward the hill. The weapon was a flamethrower, not a rifle-mounted unit, not a light assault model, a full backpack system. Fuel tanks sloshing. Hoses stiff with pressure. Igniter assembly exposed. It was never designed for solo use. Doctrine said one man carried it. Another protected him. A third sometimes fed ammunition or watched the rear. This Marine had none of that. He checked the connections once, tightened a strap already digging into his shoulders. Took one breath, then he moved. The first bunker fired immediately. Tracer rounds snapped past his head, stitching the ground around his feet. He didn't run. Running made the tanks shift too violently. One bad stumble would rupture the lines, and that would be the end. So he walked. Slow? Deliberate. Straightforward. The Marines behind him froze, not out of awe, but confusion. This wasn't a tactic. This was suicide. The Japanese gunners adjusted their fire, lowering aim, trying to catch the tanks. Bullets sparked against rock, sending fragments into his face and arms. One round clipped the metal frame of the flamethrower, ringing like a bell. He kept going. When he reached effective range, the bunker's gun was still firing. Still confident. Still certain concrete and earth would protect it. He raised the nozzle, pulled the trigger. Fire didn't explode outward. It poured. A solid stream of burning fuel slammed into the firing slit, forcing itself inside, clinging to anything it touched. The sound changed instantly, from gunfire to screaming to nothing at all. The bunker went quiet, not damaged, neutralized. He didn't stop to look. He turned left. The second bunker had already tracked him. Its gun chattered wildly, rounds tearing chunks from the ground inches from his boots. He dropped to one knee, not for cover but balance, then stood again and advanced. Fire again. Another slit vanished behind flame. Another bunker fell silent. The Marines watching understood something then. This wasn't bravery. This was momentum. And momentum, once started, was terrifying. Within minutes, the hill that had held them back for days was changing. Smoke poured from openings that had once spit bullets. Defensive fire grew erratic. Some bunkers stopped firing entirely. Not because they'd been hit, but because the men inside were afraid to expose themselves. Fear was spreading underground. The Japanese defenders had prepared for bombardment, for infantry charges, for grenades and bayonets. They had not prepared for one man who refused to stop moving. By the time he reached the third bunker, his arms were shaking. The weight of the tanks dragged at his spine. Heat rolled back toward him, scorching his face. His gloves began to smoke. Still, he kept advancing, because stopping meant dying where he stood. And somewhere behind him, an entire battle line that had been pinned, bleeding, and stalled realized the wall was cracking. One bunker at a time. By the fourth bunker, the hill was awake. Not alert, panicked. Signals ran through the tunnel network beneath the earth. Boots thundered underground as defenders shifted positions, shouting warnings that didn't need translating. The smell of burning fuel had crept into places flame hadn't reached yet, seeping through cracks, turning oxygen into poison. The Marine felt it before he saw it. Resistance changed. Instead of steady machine gun fire, bursts became wild and desperate. Rifle shots snapped blindly from firing ports that opened for half a second, then slammed shut again. They were afraid of showing themselves. That fear bought him seconds. Seconds were everything. He moved from cover to cover, not hiding but using angles. A shell crater here. A collapsed log barrier there. Every step was measured because one wrong move, one bullet through a fuel line would erase him instantly. The flamethrower hissed softly on his back, pressure holding, fuel still feeding. He checked the gauge without stopping. Enough left. Barely. The fifth bunker tried something different. A grenade rolled out of a tunnel exit at his feet. He didn't dive away. He kicked it back toward the opening with all the force he had. The explosion collapsed part of the tunnel entrance, sealing men inside alive. He didn't wait to hear what followed. He fired flame into the rubble, feeding the fire oxygen it no longer needed. The screams came anyway. By now, Marines behind him were advancing, not charging, not yelling, moving quietly, stunned by what they were watching. They followed in his wake, clearing what little resistance remained, dragging wounded, marking bunkers already silenced. Someone tried to shout at him to fall back. He didn't hear it, or he ignored it. The 6th, 7th, and 8th bunkers fell faster than the first. The defenders inside were breaking. Some abandoned their positions entirely, fleeing into tunnels that only led deeper into the inferno. Others tried to fight back with pistols and rifles at point-blank range, popping up just long enough to fire once before being consumed. Flamethrower combat was not like gunfire. There were no exchanges. There was only advance, release, and silence. His arms began to burn. The heat radiating from the nozzle scorched through his sleeves. His lungs screamed every time he inhaled smoke-laced air. Each breath tasted like metal and ash. Still, he didn't stop. The 9th bunker was reinforced, thicker concrete, narrower slit. Flames splashed against it without immediately penetrating. For the first time, it didn't work. Gunfire erupted from inside, slamming into the ground around him, trapping him in the open. This was where men usually died. Instead of retreating, he stepped closer. So close the gun barrel nearly touched him. He angled the nozzle upward, flooding the opening until flame crawled along the ceiling inside. Heat expanded. Pressure built. Then the bunker coughed. Fire blew back out through the slit in a violent burst as the interior ignited completely. The gun fell silent forever. 10 bunkers. 12 minutes. The hill that had held for weeks was unraveling faster than anyone could understand. Inside the tunnels, command and control vanished. Orders were shouted, contradicted, lost in smoke and confusion. Men ran into dead ends. Some tried to surrender to silence, curling up in the dark as the heat found them anyway. The 11th bunker didn't fire at all. When flame poured in, no one screamed. They had already fled. The 12th fought hard. Grenades, rifles, blind bayonet thrusts from the slit. It cost him fuel. More than he wanted. He checked the gauge again. Low. Too low. He made a choice then. No more wasting flame. The 13th bunker was taken with precision. A short, surgical burst directly into the opening. The 14th with a sustained stream that collapsed the interior supports. By the 15th, his hands were numb. By the 16th, he was shaking. 30 minutes had passed since he started moving. 16 bunkers, structures that had slaughtered hundreds, were silent, blackened, dead. And then the flamethrower sputtered. The fuel was gone. He lowered the nozzle and stood still for the first time since the attack began. Silence rolled across the hill. Not the peaceful kind, the stunned kind. Marines stared at him like he wasn't real. Officers forgot to speak. Even the battlefield seemed unsure what came next. Only then did the Marine turn back toward his lines. Only then did his legs buckle. They caught him before he fell. Behind him, the hill, once a fortress, was no longer a threat. It had been broken by one man using a weapon meant for two. But the cost of what he'd done was only beginning to surface. Because underground, not everyone had died. And the tunnels were still breathing. They thought it was over. From the surface, the hill looked finished. Burned openings, collapsed firing ports, black smoke bleeding lazily into the sky. 16 bunkers neutralized in half an hour should have meant victory. On paper, the position was dead. But paper never walked underground. Beneath the hill, the tunnel system still lived. It breathed through cracks in the earth. It whispered through half-burned shafts. Smoke moved downward instead of up, pulled by pressure changes deeper inside the mountain. Fire had not killed everything. It had only pushed the survivors inward, and inward was worse. The Marine was laid against a rock, mask pulled off, chest heaving, eyes red and unfocused. Medics worked fast, checking the fuel tank for leaks. Burns on his back, hands blistered raw. Someone tried to pull the empty flamethrower off him. He grabbed it, not aggressively, not fearfully, instinctively, because he knew the firing started again. Not from the bunkers, from the ground. A Marine 10 yards downslope vanished waist-deep into the earth as a tunnel trap collapsed beneath him. Screams followed, muffled, cut short. Rifle fire erupted from holes no one had marked, bullets punching upward through dirt and bodies alike. The hill had teeth. Command realized too late. The bunkers were only the shell. The tunnels were the weapon. Japanese soldiers, smoke-blinded, half-burned, desperate, were emerging behind American lines, appearing from holes that had been invisible hours earlier. They carried pistols, grenades, knives, sometimes nothing at all but rage. It became close. Too close. Bayonets flashed. Entrenching tools came down like axes. Men fought face-to-face in air that barely qualified as breathable. Orders meant nothing in the noise. The Marine staggered upright. He shouldn't have been standing. His body screamed no. His lungs felt coated in tar. His hands shook so badly he couldn't feel his fingers. But he understood something no one else did. Fire had driven them down. Now it had to finish the job. He took a rifle from a fallen Marine, checked the chamber, ignored the blood slicking the stock, and moved back toward the nearest tunnel opening. Not running. Walking. Inside the hill, the survivors were reorganizing. They were officers now. Senior NCOs. Men who understood that surrender underground meant death anyway. They planned counterattacks, set ambush points, stacked grenades by junctions, listened for footsteps above. Then they heard something else. Metal, scraping, a sound they remembered. Footsteps approached the tunnel mouth. A silhouette filled the opening, not crouched, not cautious. Just there. They fired. The shots went wide. Hands trembled. The Marine threw a grenade inside. Not deep, just enough. The blast didn't kill them all. It stunned them. Burst eardrums. Dust-choked lungs. Panic. He dropped inside before the echoes died. Tunnel fighting stripped war down to its ugliest form. No formation, no range, no air. The tunnel was shoulder width, low enough to force him to crouch. Burn marks streaked the walls. Bodies lay where they had fallen earlier, twisted, charred, eyes open in the dark. A soldier lunged at him with a bayonet. He shot him once. Another grabbed his rifle barrel. They fell together into the dirt, rolling, choking, punching, biting. The Marine slammed the buttstock into the man's face until resistance stopped. Further down, voices. He advanced. Grenades came next. One exploded close enough to knock him flat. Shrapnel tearing through his sleeve, slicing skin but missing bone. He crawled, blind for a moment, tasting blood and soil. Still moving. He reached a junction chamber. Larger, reinforced, meant for command coordination. Maps burned on the wall. Radios smashed. 3 men waited there, rifles leveled. They fired together. The shots passed inches from his head as he dropped. He rose inside their space and emptied the rifle. Silence followed. Thick, oppressive, broken only by crackling fires deeper in the hill. But the tunnels weren't done. A horn sounded somewhere far below. A signal. A last stand. He knew what it meant. They were sealing sections, trapping everyone, enemy and themselves inside, preparing for suicide charges through remaining exits. He turned back, not because he was afraid, because he understood something else now. He had become the focus. As long as he was underground, they would keep fighting. As long as he lived, they would believe fire could return. He emerged from the tunnel hours later, coated in dirt, blood not all his own, eyes sunken, hollow. The hill behind him continued to smolder, but the gunfire had faded. The counterattacks never came. By morning, engineers began collapse operations. They pumped smoke, then fuel, then fire again, this time methodical, slow, suffocating. The hill died properly. When the casualty reports came in, the numbers didn't make sense. 16 bunkers, over 100 defenders neutralized directly, dozens more underground. American losses, minimal compared to projections. One Marine accounted for the majority. He didn't attend the briefing. He sat alone, staring at his hands. They shook uncontrollably. He never asked how many died. He already knew. And he knew something worse. The weapon he carried, the one designed for 2 men, had proven what fear could do when given form. The war would remember bunkers and hills and victory. But underground, where fire replaced air, memory worked differently. Because those tunnels were quiet now, but not empty. They waited for silence. It never came. At dawn, the hill still whispered. Smoke leaked from cracks no engineer remembered sealing. The ground shifted in slow, subtle pulses, as if something below refused to accept death. The Marines slept lightly, weapons within reach, flinching at every echo that crawled up from the earth. By daylight, command believed the position was neutralized. By reality, the hill was only wounded. The Japanese doctrine underground was simple. If the surface is lost, the war continues below. Tunnels ran deeper than maps showed, some hand-dug decades earlier, others blasted through coral and stone during the campaign. Air shafts snaked hundreds of feet away from the hill, emerging in ravines, jungle floors, even dried stream beds. And men were still alive down there, wounded, starving. half blind from smoke, but alive. Shortly after sunrise, the first Marine fell. No warning shot. No movement seen. A single crack echoed from behind the American line, and a sentry collapsed with a bullet through his throat. The shooter vanished before anyone could react. Then another, and another. Snipers were emerging from exit tunnels that no one had detected, positions designed specifically for moments like this when attackers relaxed. The hill was hunting back. Orders came fast now. Burn it again. But the Marine with the flamethrower wasn't ready. They found him sitting alone behind a supply crate, helmet off, staring into nothing. His hands were wrapped in dirty bandages, fingers swollen and blistered. His uniform smelled permanently of fuel and smoke. An officer spoke to him. He didn't answer. Another officer tried. Still nothing. When they finally told him the snipers were active, his jaw tightened. He stood without speaking, reached for the weapon and then stopped. For the first time since landing on the island, he shook his head. The realization hit command like ice. The weapon that had broken the bunkers had also broken the man. And yet, the hill wasn't finished. Engineers advanced cautiously, using probes, explosive charges, listening devices pressed to the earth. Every sound made them freeze. Every shadow felt watched. Then, a charge detonated prematurely. A tunnel collapsed outward, vomiting dirt and bodies onto the slope. 3 Japanese soldiers burst free, screaming, clothes burned, faces unrecognizable. They charged blindly, firing pistols until Marines cut them down. Behind them, more movement. This wasn't a counterattack. It was an exodus. The underground defenders were running out of air. Command made the decision no one wanted to say aloud. Seal it permanently. Fuel lines were fed into every opening. Engineers timed the ignition. Marines pulled back to safe distances, eyes fixed on the ground. When the fires lit, the hill screamed, not audibly. Physically, the earth cracked. Steam and smoke erupted like breath forced from crushed lungs. The ground buckled in places, collapsing inward as oxygen vanished below. It went on for hours. By nightfall, nothing moved. No gunfire, no snipers, no whispers. The hill was finally dead. The after-action report described it clinically. Enemy resistance neutralized. But the Marines who had been there knew the truth. Neutralized didn't mean defeated. It meant buried alive. The Marine with the 2-man weapon never picked it up again. He was reassigned weeks later, quietly, without ceremony. His hands never fully stopped shaking. Loud noises made him flinch. The smell of fuel made him vomit. He received a citation. He never read it. Years later, when asked about that day, he said only one thing. "I didn't kill bunkers. I killed places men thought they could survive." The hill was bulldozed after the war, covered, erased, but veterans avoided the area long after, because sometimes late at night, when the wind hits just right, the ground still feels warm. The island moved on. Supply ships arrived. New units rotated in. Maps were updated with clean lines and simple notes, objective secured. The hill was marked as cleared, its name reduced to coordinates no one bothered to memorize. But the men who fought there didn't leave it behind. They carried it in their sleep. Weeks later, Marines started reporting sounds, scraping, hollow thumps, faint knocking that seemed to rise from the ground during the quiet hours before dawn. Engineers dismissed it as cooling rock, collapsing tunnels settling under their own weight. That explanation didn't stop the dreams. Men woke choking, convinced the air was thinning. Others swore they smelled burning fuel where none had been used for days. A few refused to dig foxholes near the hill, choosing exposed ground instead of soil that felt wrong beneath their hands. Patrols were sent anyway. What they found was nothing, and that made it worse, because absence is never empty in war. One night, a Marine on perimeter duty fired without warning. He swore something had moved, just for a second, inside a collapsed tunnel mouth. When the flare went up, there was nothing there. No body, no tracks, only disturbed dirt. Command ordered silence about it. Morale was fragile enough. The official casualty numbers from the bunker assault were revised downward over time. Some kills couldn't be confirmed. Some tunnels collapsed before bodies were counted. Others were sealed too deep for verification. History prefers certainty. This battle offered none. The Marine, the one whose hands still shook, was evacuated off the island for exhaustion. The paperwork used softer words. He didn't argue. He didn't look back when the transport plane lifted off. But before he left, he returned once, alone, to the edge of the hill. He stood there longer than anyone realized. Not in triumph, not in grief, in listening. He later said he wanted to be sure it was over. Years after the war, intelligence officers uncovered documents taken from captured Japanese units on the island. Hand-drawn tunnel diagrams. Notes scribbled in margins. Orders passed verbally, never written. One line appeared again and again. Hold the underground at all costs. Another note, written shakily in charcoal, was translated later. Fire follows us even where there is no sky. The bunker complex became a case study. Military academies studied it as an example of rapid fortification collapse. Engineers analyzed flame saturation patterns. Psychologists examined the effects of tunnel warfare on both attacker and defender. They focused on tactics. They ignored the human residue, because there was no category for it. The hill never produced another shot. No more movement, no more signs. And yet, no one ever built on it. Decades later, locals still avoided the place. Construction crews refused contracts nearby. Machinery failed inexplicably. Digging equipment broke teeth on buried steel and bone. Officially, it's just unstable ground. Unofficially, everyone knows better. The war moved on to bloodier beaches, larger battles, louder victories. But for those who were there, this was the fight that stayed. Not because of how fast it ended, but because of how completely it erased everyone inside. Fire didn't just destroy the bunkers. It erased the idea that underground meant safe. And once that belief died, so did everything built on it. Long after the island was declared secure, long after the maps were redrawn and the units reassigned, the lesson of that hill spread quietly through the Pacific. Not as a headline, as a warning. Japanese bunker doctrine had relied on something ancient and unshakable. If you control the ground beneath your enemy's feet, you control the battle. For years, it worked. Caves defeated artillery. Tunnels survived bombardment. Concrete swallowed bullets. Men vanished into the earth and became ghosts with rifles. Until that morning. Until a two-man weapon was carried by one exhausted Marine who refused to stop walking forward. After the hill fell, Japanese commanders began altering their defenses. Tunnel systems became deeper but fewer. Escape routes were widened. Ammunition was cached farther back. Some positions were abandoned entirely, rather than risk fire being brought inside again. The fear had traveled faster than any report, because fire doesn't need accuracy. It only needs oxygen. Allied forces noticed the change almost immediately. Resistance softened in places that should have been nightmares. Bunkers that once fought to the last man were found empty, booby-trapped, abandoned in silence. The weapon hadn't just destroyed bunkers. It destroyed confidence, and confidence was the strongest defense underground. The Marine who carried it disappeared into civilian life after the war. No interviews. No speeches. No books. His citation gathered dust in a box he never opened. When asked once, years later, if he was proud of what he did, he answered quietly, "Proud isn't the word. Necessary is." He never spoke about the tunnels, never spoke about the sounds, never spoke about the moment when fire filled a space that had no sky. But those who served with him remembered one detail he couldn't hide. Whenever he entered a room, he always checked the exits first. The island itself changed with time. Jungle reclaimed concrete. Rain softened scars. The hill became just another rise in the landscape, indistinguishable to anyone who didn't know where to look. But beneath it, everything remained. Collapsed chambers, melted steel, weapons frozen where hands dropped them, men who believed the earth would protect them, sealed forever inside it. Archaeologists would later say the site should be left undisturbed, not for respect, for stability. Some places, they argued, are better left closed, because the hill proved something that still echoes through modern warfare. The deadliest weapons aren't always the most advanced. Sometimes they are the ones that remove hope. And on that island, in 30 minutes of fire and smoke, an entire doctrine died underground. Not with a charge, not with a surrender, but with silence. This is Dark War Records, where history doesn't end in victory. It ends in consequences. The war didn't end on the island. It followed them. Months later, on a completely different front, Marines found themselves hesitating at tunnel mouths they would have charged weeks earlier. Men paused longer than necessary. Orders were repeated twice. Someone always asked the same question first. Do we burn it or seal it? The hill had changed something fundamental. Not strategy. Instinct. Veterans of that fight recognized underground positions instantly, not by shape or markings, but by how wrong the air felt around them. A stillness that didn't belong to nature. A quiet that felt intentional. They trusted that feeling more than maps. Some units refused to enter caves at all. They called for engineers immediately. Others lit fires at tunnel mouths without orders, just to watch how the smoke moved. If it flowed inward, they stepped back, because they remembered. The Marine with the two-man weapon became a reference point in unofficial conversations. Not by name, never by name. They called him the one-man fire. New recruits didn't believe the stories. They laughed. They always laughed, until they stood in front of their first tunnel and realized laughter didn't travel underground very well. Back home, the silence was different, but just as heavy. Veterans returned to towns where streets were open, skies wide, buildings hollow and harmless. But some couldn't sleep unless doors stayed open. Others panicked in basements, cellars, even subways. Confined spaces stole their breath. Fire alarms made grown men drop to the floor. No one called it trauma then. They called it nerves. The Marine never spoke publicly. He avoided crowds. He avoided ceremony. When children asked him what the war was like, he told them it was loud. That was all. But privately, his nights were worse. Because silence doesn't mean peace. It means memory has room to speak. He dreamed of tunnels that never ended. Of chambers where the air grew thinner with every step. Of voices he couldn't see calling out from behind walls that wouldn't break. He always woke before the fire started. Always. The Pacific campaign continued. Island after island fell. Some bunker systems fought harder. Some surrendered faster. Intelligence officers noticed a pattern they couldn't quite explain. Where fire had been used effectively once, resistance collapsed sooner the next time. Fear, it turned out, was transferable. Enemy units passed stories the same way Allied units did, quietly, urgently, without documentation. There was a name whispered among Japanese soldiers for what happened underground. It translated loosely to, the place where air betrays you. And once soldiers believed that, no concrete wall felt thick enough. The war ended months later with explosions so large they eclipsed everything that came before. History focused on those moments. On surrender documents, on flags and photographs and speeches, no one mentioned the hill. No one mentioned the bunkers. No one mentioned the Marine who walked forward when others stopped. Because his victory didn't look like victory. It looked like absence. And absence is hard to celebrate. But those who survived knew. They knew that somewhere between the first flame and the final collapse, the nature of underground warfare had changed forever. Not because a weapon was invented, but because someone proved that nowhere, not even the Earth itself, was safe. By late 1944, something strange began appearing in reconnaissance reports across the Pacific. Caves without ammunition. Bunkers without crews. Tunnel mouths deliberately collapsed from the inside. Entire defensive networks abandoned before a single shot was fired. Japanese engineers had once been famous for digging deeper, smarter, more complex underground systems than anyone else. Now captured documents told a different story. Orders were changing, not officially, quietly. Field commanders were being told to avoid prolonged underground defense when fire weapons were present. Some units were instructed to fight on the surface longer, where death was faster, rather than retreat into caves that might become sealed tombs. That fear had a source, and everyone knew it. Stories moved faster than bullets. Soldiers whispered about hills that burned from the inside out. About bunkers that survived artillery only to die suffocating, invisible deaths. About Americans who didn't stop when fire ran out who came inside anyway. The two-man weapon had become a psychological weapon, not because of how many it killed, but because of how it killed hope. Intelligence officers noticed another shift. Japanese counterattacks grew more desperate, more sudden. Banzai charges returned in places where tunnel warfare once dominated. Men chose speed over concealment. Because speed still allowed choice, tunnels did not. The Marine never learned how far the impact traveled. He didn't read reports. He didn't attend briefings. He spent the remainder of the war in support roles that kept him away from enclosed spaces. But the weapon stayed. Improved. Refined. Engineers reinforced fuel lines, increased ignition reliability, extended range. Training manuals were rewritten. Diagrams replaced words. New units were taught one rule above all others. Never assume underground means neutralized. Because the hill had proven the opposite. In one briefing, an officer summarized the lesson in a single sentence. Once fire enters a tunnel, the battle doesn't end. It accelerates. And that scared everyone in the room. After the war, Allied analysts reviewed Japanese defensive failures. They attributed collapse to logistics, morale, overwhelming force. Only one footnote mentioned fire. It was brief, almost dismissive. But veterans noticed something historians didn't. From that island onward, fewer tunnels were defended to the last man. Fewer soldiers waited underground. The enemy had learned. And learning, in war, is survival. The Marine returned home carrying no souvenirs, no photos, no trophies. Only habits he couldn't explain to anyone else. Checking airflow in rooms, cracking windows in winter, standing near exits in theaters. Once, years later, someone asked him what scared him most during the war. They expected an answer about combat. He shook his head. Silence, he said. Because silence underground isn't empty. It's waiting. The hill never appeared in textbooks, but its influence stretched far beyond that island. It rewrote how armies thought about hiding. Because after that day, digging deeper stopped being protection. It became a gamble. Years passed. The war ended. But for some of the men who fought on that island, time didn't move forward the same way. They returned to normal lives, factories, farms, offices, families, but something inside them remained underground. Conversations felt too tight. Rooms felt too small. Silence felt heavy instead of peaceful. They avoided basements, avoided mines, avoided any place where walls pressed in too closely. Doctors didn't know what to call it yet. Some said fatigue. Some said nerves. Some said it would pass. It didn't. One Marine who had followed the flamethrower assault refused to sleep indoors. Even in winter, he built a lean-to behind his house. Another quit his job when he was assigned to work in a boiler room. A third panicked during a subway ride and never rode one again. They shared the same dreams. Air running out. Walls closing in. Fire somewhere behind them, not chasing, but spreading. The Marine, the one-man carrier of a two-man weapon, kept moving from town to town after the war. Not running. Just never staying long. He worked jobs that kept him outdoors. Road crews, forestry, shipping yards, anywhere with sky. Once, a former officer recognized him and tried to talk about the island. Tried to thank him. The Marine stopped him gently. "Don't," he said. "If you say it out loud, it becomes real again." Some battles fade because they're forgotten. That one stayed because no one could forget it. Meanwhile, historians debated numbers. How many bunkers? How many defenders? How decisive was the engagement? They argued over diagrams and casualty figures, completely missing the real outcome. The hill didn't just fall. It broke a belief system. Before that island, underground warfare was considered the equalizer. It neutralized air power. It resisted artillery. It exhausted attackers. After that island, underground became a liability, a trap, a coffin waiting for air to run out. Foreign militaries studied the lessons quietly. Some adopted similar tactics. Others tried to design defenses that could never be sealed, never burned, never suffocated. None succeeded completely, because the problem wasn't engineering. It was fear. Fear doesn't follow blueprints. It follows stories. And the story of that hill spread without borders. In private interviews decades later, Japanese veterans admitted something Western analysts never predicted. They weren't afraid of dying in battle. They were afraid of dying unseen. Afraid of being buried alive by decisions made above ground. Afraid of fighting an enemy who would take the air itself away. That fear ended more resistance than bombs ever did. The Marine lived long enough to see the war become history. He never attended reunions, never visited memorials. But once, late in life, he visited a museum that displayed a restored flamethrower behind glass. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned away and said quietly, "That thing didn't win the fight." People around him waited. He finished the thought. The hill lost it. The final lesson of that hill didn't arrive during the battle. It arrived years later, long after the guns fell silent, long after uniforms were folded away, long after the world decided it had moved on. Military historians eventually categorized the assault as a tactical success. Engineers logged it as an example of effective bunker neutralization. Strategists filed it under combined arms adaptation. But none of those words captured what really changed. Because after that island, something subtle happened in warfare. Armies stopped trusting the ground beneath them. During later conflicts, commanders hesitated before ordering troops underground. Tunnels were probed longer. Caves were sealed faster. Fire was used not just as a weapon, but as a message. You can hide anywhere, except where air must travel. The idea of safe depth died on that hill. The Marine, older now, slower, once wrote a short letter to a fellow veteran. It was never meant for publication. It was found after his death, folded inside a box with no medals. It read, "They taught us the Earth would protect us. They were wrong. The Earth remembers everything." By the time World War II officially closed its final chapter, millions were dead, cities erased, borders redrawn. This battle didn't change the war's outcome. It changed how wars would be fought, because it proved something terrifyingly simple. The most powerful weapon isn't fire. It isn't steel. It isn't numbers. It's the moment an enemy realizes there is nowhere left to breathe. The hill still exists, covered in vegetation. Quiet. Unremarkable. People walk over it now without knowing what lies beneath their feet. But underground, everything is still exactly where it ended. Weapons rusting in darkness. Passageways sealed forever. Men who believed the ground itself was an ally. They were wrong, and that mistake cost them everything. History often remembers wars for their loudest moments, but the deadliest changes happen quietly, in places where air runs out, where hope collapses faster than concrete, where victory doesn't arrive with cheers, but with silence. If this story disturbed you, it should have, because it wasn't about one weapon, or one Marine, or one hill. It was about the day the Earth stopped being safe. This is Dark War Records, where war isn't told to glorify, but to remind, so it is never repeated.